One of the ways that nonprofits have an impact and advance their mission is through the execution of programs and services. And the way they gather people in support of their programs, services, and mission is through events. So in this lesson, we're going to talk all about nonprofit programs, events, and services. Nonprofits serve their community in many ways. One of the ways they do this is through programs, events, and services. So in this lesson, we're going to talk all about how nonprofits can engage in these activities, both as fundraising tools, but also ways to engage their communities and provide service to beneficiaries. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand the difference and distinctions between programs and services, and you'll also be able to identify the most common forms of nonprofit programs. You'll understand the elements that nonprofit leaders should consider when they go about designing programs. And we'll talk about the ways that event planners should consider mission when they're designing their events. We'll also talk about fundraising versus non-fundraising events. First, let's talk about programs and services, what they are, how they're alike, but also how they're different. When you're looking at nonprofit work, think of a program as that umbrella level. This is that top level. These are your broad, longer range initiatives. So programs are structured at achieving those long-term mission-driven goals. So when we do strategic planning, we set forth the mission, we set those overarching goals, and those programs are in support of those things. Services, on the other hand, are more specific. They're more short-term. They are related to those immediate offerings that are needed to directly address individual or community needs. So you have programs up at the top level, and then falling underneath that are your services. Any type of nonprofit is able to hold programs, services, and events, but the frequency and the type of programs, services, and events they host is going to vary. So programs is overarching, and then services falls underneath that, and many agencies have a multitude of services that fall underneath each specific program. Now that you know that nonprofit programs are those long-range overarching objectives, let's talk about the most common forms of nonprofit programs. And remember, nonprofit programs, they're those broad, long-range, structured activities that are intended to achieve specific objectives in alignment with that nonprofit's overarching mission and strategic plan. And those services are those immediate offerings that help fulfill those needs. Now, if you look at an organizational chart, which we covered in a previous lesson, we can actually design our programs and services in a way where we are departmentalizing our program. So if I run a nonprofit called Youth in Need that provides services to at-risk youth, I might have 3 overarching programs. I have housing program, I have a resources program, and I have an education program. And then within each of these programs, underneath them in the org chart, I have specific services that fulfill direct and immediate needs of the community that fall under the purview of that longer range overarching program. For my housing program, I might have an emergency shelter and transitional housing. So the emergency shelter and that transitional housing, those are those immediate actual services that we're deploying on the ground that are in support of that overarching program being housing. I might have an education program where I provide job training and GED completion. So education is the overarching program, but then all of the work that I do of executing services related to education fall under that educational program. And then finally, I might have a resources program. So my goal and program here is to provide resources. But then those services that fall underneath that resources program are those direct, immediate services. Street team outreach to identify and connect with unhoused youth. I might have a medical clinic, and I also might have a food pantry. So this kind of describes how programs and services are interrelated with one another and how you can actually put them graphically on an organizational chart and use organizational design in conjunction with our program design to determine the best way to group resources and people in our organizations. Just like we have to put a ton of thought into our organizational design, we spent a whole lesson talking about that. Nonprofit leaders also need to put some thought and strategy behind their program design. Arguably the most important reason for putting a lot of thought, effort, and strategy into program design is that as nonprofit leaders, we are working with extremely limited resources. We can't go out there and try to do it all. It's going to be a waste of money. We can't feasibly do it. So when it comes to resource allocation, program design helps us determine how we're going to distribute those limited resources. And that can be our people resources, both staff and volunteers, our financial resources, and even things like our materials. And what it takes to execute a program and to deliver the services within that program needs to be a consideration as we're designing our programs. So looking at our mission and determining what are the most important needs in terms of programs that we can feasibly offer given our resource constraints that directly support our mission the best. Program design also needs to be thoughtful and intentional from a quality assurance standpoint. If you're a nonprofit leader and you're running out there and trying to be everything to everyone in the community, well, one, not only do you likely lack the resources to do that, but even if you were able to try to do 20 different programs, you're probably not going to be executing quality programs. So as nonprofit leaders, even if we're offering a free service and benefit to the community, we want to make sure it's still a high quality program and a high quality service. So we have quality standards. And if we're trying to do everything and we're not focusing on a core set of programs that directly support the mission, then we're running around like a chicken with its head cut off. And then finally, program evaluation and monitoring. Good leaders assess the impact and effectiveness of our programs and our services. We do this through program impact reports. And doing this takes a lot of work and effort. So measuring outcomes, collecting data, gathering feedback, surveying our beneficiaries and our constituents and our service recipients. This takes a lot of time and work. And if you're trying to do this across 30 overarching broad programs and hundreds of boots on the ground services, you're going to spend your entire time evaluating and monitoring and not actually executing programs and services. So if we try to do too many things or we try to do the wrong things that are not directly tied to mission, we're doing a disservice to our cause. In many nonprofit agencies, programs and services generally refer to community-based activities that we're providing to the community or to beneficiaries or people in need. And generally we do this at a low or subsidized or at no cost at all. But also in many cases, nonprofits host events. Some of these events are fundraising in nature. Some of these events are more educational in nature or don't necessarily have a fundraising component tied to it. So in this section, I want to talk specifically about nonprofit events. We've discussed programs and services, but let's pivot now to events and talk about how important it is to tie in things like a mission moment and guest experience when we're designing those events. So nonprofit events. These are those organized activities that gather people around, usually people that have some connection or interest in the cause, but it can be for various purposes. But at the end of the day, these events are in support of the organizational mission and that nonprofit's objectives. And events are different than programs and services. Programs and services are about fulfilling needs for the community. Events are more about gathering people together. But just like nonprofit leaders need to put a lot of thought and strategy into program design, they also need to be just as thoughtful when it comes to designing events. And again, events can be either fundraising events like your cocktail parties, your runs, your walks, your rides, or they can be non-fundraising. But with all of these events, we need to be mindful of trying to have a moment in that event or during that event where we have a mission moment. This is where we dedicate a portion of that event, either on stage or whatever the type of event is. It's a time where we take a pause and we share with all attendees at the event information to educate about our mission and the importance of their support. And sometimes in the nonprofit sector, this gets a little bit lost. We get so focused on hosting successful or fun events that everybody wants to come to, or that is going to have a great reputation in the community, that sometimes we lose sight a little bit of making sure that we're always integrating the mission. Because not everyone that attends an event is going to be directly affected by your mission or its cause. Events are a great way to broaden our reach and influence in a community and build awareness of our agency, our mission, and our cause. So having that mission moment is a pivotal opportunity to educate and build awareness. Many times, nonprofit events are designed for donors to either recruit donors, to attract donors, or to keep our donors happy and engaged. And we need to make sure when we're designing events that we are giving a good experience to those donors. Because if we host an event and it's trash and it's a big mess and it's disorganized and it's chaotic and we don't have a mission moment and people are wondering, why are we here? What cause does this support? It can leave a bad taste in the mouth of a prospective or even a current donor, and that can influence our fundraising in a negative way. And when it comes to donor attendance at events and all of the other ways that they engage with our nonprofit agencies, that sum of all of those touch points that a donor has with that agency can be summarized into what we call the donor experience. So in the nonprofit sector, we're always being mindful of ensuring that we have a great donor experience. from the minute a donor enters our organization, before they're even a donor, to the point where they've made a gift and now we're engaging in that stewardship and that continued cycle. We need to ensure it's a good, positive experience. And that mission always stays at the forefront. While not all nonprofit events are fundraising in nature, many of them are. Because as we discussed in a previous lesson, fundraising events is one of those revenue generating activities that nonprofits engage in. So it helps us raise money to support our cause, pay the bills, keep the lights on, and support our mission. So if you look at all the different events offered by nonprofits in the world, you'll find a lot of variety. There is literally no limit on the types of events that a nonprofit can host and use as a driver for fundraising. And I've seen some really innovative and creative ideas. But generally speaking, if you look at the majority of nonprofit fundraising events, they can be categorized into 5 common categories. These are galas, cocktail parties, endurance events, golf outings, and benefit performances. So if you work in a nonprofit agency or you're doing an agency analysis, now's a good time to assess the types of fundraising events that you hold each year and determine if maybe there's some opportunity to add additional fundraising events. First, let's talk about galas. Galas are these black tie formal events. Everybody gets all gussied up. It's usually a high dollar ticket. Corporate sponsorship is generally an important fundraising aspect of a gala. So corporations will pay to sponsor a table. Sometimes these are upwards of $10, $25, or even $50,000. And all the guests come into a venue. It's normally beautifully decorated. They sit down at an assigned table usually and enjoy a plated meal that is served to them. There's usually entertainment, there are auctions, and these auctions can be of different types. Auctions can include live auctions where your guests are seated in the ballroom. You have an auctioneer who's auctioning off high ticket, high dollar items and packages, usually that are exclusive in nature. So you might have tickets to the Super Bowl. So these are things that are generally hard to get and that are going to sell for a big dollar amount. Silent auctions are also an aspect of galas. This is where your attendees can bid on smaller packages. Usually your big, expensive, highly valuable, highly coveted packages are going to go in live auctions, and those smaller items and those smaller packages go in the silent auctions. And a lot of nonprofits now have really embraced online auctions. So they'll usually supplement their in-person silent auction with online bidding. So folks that are not even in attendance at the event can participate as well. I personally have done all of these things when leading a nonprofit, and I can tell you that offering an online aspect in addition to the traditional in-person silent auction and opening up bidding for anyone significantly increased our auction revenue. And another big fundraising driver within a gala fundraising event is Fund a Need. This is a moment where we're going to have a mission moment at the event, where we have an auctioneer who comes to the stage. We have someone who shares their story. We do that storytelling, explaining the importance of the mission, explaining how that agency has positively impacted that person's life, and then making a call to people in attendance in that room to please make an outright financial contribution. So you're not bidding on an auction item, but you're bidding on the mission. So when you hold up your bid card and say, I'm bidding $1,000 to this mission, that's basically signaling I'm donating $1,000 outright. So the guest is not getting anything in return. They're not buying Super Bowl tickets. They are directly donating, but they're doing it in a space where they're getting a lot of social recognition. Their friends are seeing she's donating. She must be philanthropic. So there's a bit of a peer pressure aspect that makes Fund a Need very successful in a gala setting. But the important thing is even if an agency hosts a gala, they don't do Fund a Need as a formal auction for fundraising. It's really important that they integrate that mission moment within the program. And when I say program here in this context, I mean the show flow, the people that come on stage, what time they come on stage, how long they talk, and that sort of thing. Galas are awesome. And for many nonprofits, it is their number one revenue generator for fundraising events in terms of dollar amounts. When I ran a nonprofit, our gala was consistently over $1 million fundraiser each year. In one record year, we raised over $2.5 million, and that's from one event. So galas can be very lucrative as a fundraising vehicle. Galas, however, they're very expensive. It's very expensive to have an open bar at a convention center or a big formal fancy venue. It's expensive to decorate a venue to accommodate a gala. It's expensive to have lighting and food and a catered meal that's a plated sit-down dinner. So a lot of nonprofits have started to adopt a sort of gala light approach. because galas are also very labor intensive. Even if you have a great volunteer base, it takes a lot of man hours to execute. Cocktail parties are like baby galas. They're not as expensive, they're not as labor intensive, and they're less formal. And what's nice about cocktail parties is that not everybody who is interested in attending a fundraising event wants to go get their hair done and their nails done and get a fancy dress or rent a tuxedo, nor do they own a tuxedo. Sometimes people just don't like really formal events. It's kind of like a prom for adults. So with a cocktail party, it's a less formal event. Usually women wear short dresses, men don't wear a tux, but they usually wear a jacket or at least a tie or a bow tie. And the cost of admission to a cocktail party is generally much more accessible. Instead of $500 a couple, it might be $150 a couple. So usually there is a ticket cost still associated with nonprofit fundraising cocktail parties, but it's a much more accessible ticket price. So that lessens that barrier to entry. When I led a nonprofit that had a huge gala, I knew of a lot of supporters who would have loved to have attended that event, but they couldn't swing $500 for 2 tickets. And they also couldn't afford all of the things that go into getting yourself prepared to attend a black tie event. So cocktail parties are a much more accessible fundraising event like a gala, and the program follows a similar format to a gala, with auctions and people on stage, having a mission moment, sharing information about the cause, doing a live auction with bidding. It can have all of those other things as well, but in a less formal setting. And it's a lot more affordable and it takes way less man hours to execute. And it's more accessible to your constituent base. Now, are cocktail parties generally raising as much money as galas? Usually they are not. And some nonprofits will have both. When I ran a nonprofit, we had our huge gala, but I also had at least one cocktail party event each year that actually became very successful, bringing in about $250,000. So it was great to have that additional fundraising revenue, especially without the labor intensiveness and cost of a gala. So in my case, we had both. Now, switching gears to another type of event, we've got galas, we've got cocktail parties. These are more your fancy pants kind of events. Even a cocktail party, which is less fancy pants, but still fancy nonetheless. Some people are not into that at all. Some people want to support your cause. They want to attend events. They'll even pay to attend your events as a fundraising vehicle, but they don't want to be gussied up in any way. So some nonprofits will host endurance events. This is where participants raise money by engaging in some type of physical activity. So they might go out and climb 20 flights of stairs to raise money for a lung organization. They might ride a bike. They might raise money from their friends and do polar bear plunge. So these are things that require some degree of physical activity. So if I want to go do the polar bear plunge and put on a bathing suit when it's 20 degrees outside and jump in water, I'm going to go to my friends and raise money from them. I'm using my participation in the activity as a means and a vehicle to solicit sponsorships from my friends, my family, and my network. So I'll go to them and say, I'm going to do this crazy thing. I'm going to go jump in cold water in nothing but a bathing suit. Would you be willing to donate to support me in doing this? And it goes to my favorite nonprofit cause. So they're meant to be peer-to-peer fundraisers where you engage participants who want to do something that's physical in nature, and they raise money from their peers in the process. Probably the most common endurance events and or peer-to-peer events in the nonprofit sector are walks. You see a lot of 5 and 10K charity walks. There are marathons and bike rides. Another fundraising event that is physical in nature but has its own category because it is quite a bit different are golf outings. So these are pretty common. This is where participants pay to play golf either in a tournament style or in a less formal setting. And the proceeds that they pay for those entry fees or for a foursome, those go to benefit the nonprofit. In golf outings, a lot of nonprofits will raise money in additional ways, not just through admission. It can be things like a silent auction. It can be things like extra contest, like closest to the pin, or a hole-in-one competition. And they often will sell whole sponsorships to corporations. So a corporation can pay to sponsor the event. They'll have a sign with their logo and their brand on a specified hole. Some nonprofits host benefit performances. This is very common in the arts, but not exclusive to the arts. This is where they host concerts, performances, or musical events with a ticket or admission price, and that ticket or admission cost goes to benefit the nonprofit agency. Now, at all of these things, I don't care if it's a benefit performance, a golf outing, or an endurance event, just like with our cocktail parties and our galas, all events need to have a mission moment, a time during the concert or a time during the golf outing when everyone's gathered back at the clubhouse after the event, where you take a moment, you pause, you ask everyone to please be quiet and pay attention, and you have that mission moment. You have someone there who's willing to share their story and explain to all event participants why it's so important that they're there, to thank them for their support, to share the impact that the cause has had on that person's life, and to ask them for their continued support. So fundraising events, they're fantastic. It's a great way to build awareness of your cause outside of your core constituency. It's a great way to raise additional funds. I've had many donors who would dutifully donate $1,000 a year consistently, but they never would donate more. But then when I host an event that they like and they want to come to, now all of a sudden they want to support that event and donate and support the mission moment. So it can really amplify the giving. It also can expand reach of your awareness and your cause to a broader audience, especially the corporate community. Many attendees at things like a golf outing might not have any connection to your cause at all, but they get a day off of work from their corporate job to go network and to benefit a charity. So you get attendees from a broader sphere of influence. Now that we've discussed the categories of common nonprofit fundraising events, let's talk about the events that are non-revenue and also talk about the distinctions between non-revenue events and programs and services. So again, programs and services, that's meant to be fulfilling the needs of the community. Events are about gathering people together to engage them in a certain event or activity. And nonprofits will often host non-revenue events. So these are events that are not meant to raise money, but instead they have the objective of building awareness of the cause, engaging supporters in advocacy efforts, recognizing supporters, cultivating donors, or educating. So these are different than programs and services. Programs and services are about program delivery. You're delivering your programs to the community directly through services, whereas non-revenue events are gathering people for these purposes that are not related to program delivery. Attending a non-revenue event doesn't mean that it's free to attend. Some nonprofits will still sell tickets or require a cost of admission, so they may still generate some revenue, or there may be some corporate sponsorship levels, but that's not their primary purpose. Their primary purpose is to do things like awareness and networking, advocacy, recognizing supporters, cultivating donors, and educating. So let's talk in a little bit more detail about these 5 categories of non-revenue events. First are awareness and networking events. Nonprofits can host any array of activities that get people together to build awareness of the cause and to allow them to network. This can be things like picnics, potlucks, happy hours, bowling events. There's literally no limitation on what this can look like. But the purpose here is not to bring in money, but it is to get people together to share information about the cause and allow the nonprofit to network with the attendees and the attendees to network with each other. Advocacy events are those things that we talked about in the previous lesson. This is where we rally our troops and we mobilize them to get them together to advocate for legislative change, policy changes, and social justice that are around in support of our mission and our cause. This can be things like organized marches or lobbying or even a sit-in as a form of civil disobedience. Supporter recognition events. This is an important part of a volunteer program. Remember in that lesson, we talked a lot about the ways that we acknowledge and thank our volunteers and that volunteer cycle. And we need to steward our donors. And the way that we do that is by recognizing them. Many nonprofits will host an annual ceremony where they invite and recognize their supporters, namely, in this case, their volunteers, and they also recognize sometimes their top donors. But this is giving them that love and really expressing to them the change that they've impacted through their support. And we spent an entire previous lesson talking about donors and that donor cycle. And donor cultivation events fall within that cycle. This is where we are cultivating our donors. We're trying to foster and strengthen relationships with our current and prospective donors. So these are usually smaller events. Sometimes a donor will host it in his or her house. There's past hors d'oeuvres. People meet and mingle. It's usually on a Wednesday or Thursday night. And there is a mission moment where we pause the networking. Someone tells their story to get donors excited about the cause and explaining why it's important that the agency has that donor support. And then educational events. These are things like conferences or symposia that gather experts and researchers for discussions, idea sharing, education, and collaboration. When I led a diabetes cause, I would host an annual educational conference that was free to the community that would educate folks who were impacted by diabetes to help them improve the quality of their lives. And we did have a vendor fair where vendors would pay to exhibit. And it was great because that did bring in some revenue and that helped offset the cost of the event. But what made that a non-revenue event was the fact that it was not primarily revenue generating or fundraising in nature. The purpose of that event primarily was to serve as an educational event to inform. Whether it's a golf outing, a food drive, a black tie gala, All nonprofit programs, events, and services play their own role in advancing the mission. That is, if nonprofit leaders have put in the strategy and intention in designing those programs, events, and services, and in doing so, always ensuring that mission stays at the forefront.